Hi everyone, thanks for coming to Caesar, and thanks for coming to this. We have Fatima Haider and Lourdes Carlo, and they're going to be talking about their exhibition, or we're going to do questions to start things off, or however we're going to run it. So,
I think we'll start with questions. Yeah.
Why did you do this?
Well, we've known each other for the last year and a half or two. We have studios in the same building. We talk a lot about the work, each other's work. We found things in common. We also found a lot of differences, but we never kind of saw it together. I think that was the reason to put up the work. And see where things met and where things kind of went apart in our practices.
Yeah, and I think we're being like in conversation. While we got in the call, we saw that we had things in common and we started discussing the work between each other. So we're having a real conversation in our practices with the work. So we always were like discussing our practices together and giving each other opinions, and I think it was very good for us to push the work there. So because there's a community, but it's not a real community that like an academic community that we sit and have critiques. So we decided to criticize each other's work and talk about the things that we have in common, or share readings, or all these things start growing around the work, and then inform both works. And then I think we influence each other, and we also saw our differences at the same time. And it was for us very important to see that coming together at the end of the program.
I think we also have really different approaches. Like we're very not even just different approaches, we're really different people, and our kind of our way of thinking seemed to, when we were talking, our way of thinking seemed to come together. I mean, our mediums were very different, our kind of grad school concentrations were really different, and we both kind of coming at a point where we just finished grad school and had, I mean, Lourdes was at a sculpture department, I was at a painting department, but I had started thinking about photography at the end of grad school, and it wasn't something that I kind of was familiar with or knew where it fit into my practice. And I think that was one of the things in the exhibition, in this specific work, that needed to be shown for myself. Yeah.
We approach, I think, the image in a very similar way. Like even your pieces are painting related, and I deal with photograph, but they have things in common. We're dealing with, that's why the show is called this, because of that essay, that Rosalind Krauss essay, that talks about the quasi-tautological in terms of the image, how we grasp reality. It's almost like an imprint that is like real, and then from there comes out the discussion in our work. Mm-hmm. But we approach it like we have different approaches how we about the image. I use the photograph, you use the imprint. Mm-hmm. But they're very similar, but the results are very different. Mm-hmm.
The process is really different too.
Yeah. So, but at the same time, we start discussing the work. It's like we have very similar sensibilities, but then we made the gesture like different, the opposite. And we were talking about it the other day, and then we start laughing because it's like we have things are very similar, and then when we had to make the gestures, it's like jumping on the opposite side.
Well, I've been wondering about that in terms of when you're working closely with somebody else, when you're not collaborating and not not a joint project. But when your work is constantly bumping up against somebody else's work, I mean, it almost seems like sort of that deliberate but unintentional. But I'm not like you. That's happening here. That's kind of what you're describing, right? That it's if you do it that way, I'll do it the other way.
But it's natural,
right?
It's not forced, just like the way we are. And also being an individual, have our own voices is important for us in art. That we have a very specific approach or very specific point of view. I think is important.
Well, also, you, Lourdes, I think you said something about graphing or crafting reality.
Grasping.
Can you talk about what you mean by that and how you think you do it differently?
Well, I was talking about the image, how we grasp images in the real world is very different. I use it through the camera, through that apparatus, and then she uses her hand, like rubbing the surfaces. But we're both like dealing with the real. She deals more with the intimate. I deal more with the power structures that are outside. So they're different, but we're trying to grasp that reality and complicate it. So that's why I was thinking about that.
Right, because it seems like within both practices, it's the sort of idea of a phenomenological present indicated by a trace, right? Whether it's an imprint or an index of a rubbing or like a photograph or something sort of wrenched from the world and recontextualized. And then it starts to split, or like the gestures by which you point to this collide and then sort of push apart.
Exactly.
They're also very different spaces to start with, though. I mean, a window space, which then becomes a wall space in your work, for instance. But a window is the space between the inside and the outside, whereas the bed is a completely private, intimate kind of, it kind of navigates the interior space. So I do think that's a kind of the opposite.
And also you're putting in public your intimate space.
Well, it's the space under it's also an unknown to me. It's not a space that you kind of are familiar with, even in your own intimate surrounding.
What I'm finding interesting, though, in both bodies' work is that each of you is taking a space that it's like a slice of space that ought to do this. So a window implies this, and the space under the bed is this. It's like a slice of dark air, and each of you represents it in a manner that completely compresses it, and you wind up with a strange sense of weight in these, like Peter Pan's shadow. I mean, it's very intriguing.
I understand, and it's true.
Yeah, I was thinking it just box in, like the windows, they just box in, like when you look at them from the back side. The same with your bed, it's just like you don't see gestures anymore, it's just like a dark, it's like a richer Sarah.
Yeah, flat and weight, like there's a lot of weight there, yeah.
I think the this in the middle of the room sort of kind of frees that up a bit, though. I think it's a nice sort of like mediation between the illusionistic space in the photographs or even with the wall pieces. So I think that's really interesting. Kind of throws you off when you try to get a grasp of this show.
In what sense?
I don't know exactly, because like when you think about a window, like the space that it has, and then it kind of collapses because of the bricks that are in it. But maybe that's more about the body in a way, the viewer's body.
I like that. Yesterday when we put in the show together, and I like it that I enter the space and this is a piece, this is another piece. But when you turn around and you go where this area, this becomes one thing. So it brings it together as a circle, because of the formal play. And I like it that it's like we're separate, but we take consideration of each other to put this show together and make it work as a one thing, and it becomes solid. So for me, I was very happy to see that coming together.
I think it also changes and Molly and I were talking about this outside, but the context of the work, you know, like, for instance, the photographic piece is new for me. It's a newer thing in the work. It's kind of unfamiliar to me at this point as well. But to see the rubbing in relation to something other than itself kind of becomes absorptive, and it kind of, for me, what the interesting part is to see how the context keeps changing, and that's also in some ways the way that I felt about the space that I was rubbing specifically. You know, the space under the bed, and the bed I've been shifting around, so the bed keeps changing, but that's the thing that grounds my sense of space, my personal sense of space.
Did you actually go under your bed to rub that?
Yes. At some point I just took the mattress out and it was just the frame. Yeah.
But for a while, you didn't take the mattress out.
Yeah, but it was really claustrophobic. You can't do it.
So you just need some studio space.
She has a good studio.
I didn't want to be in the studio at that point.
Were you hiding?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're hiding.
Yeah.
But it never, at the point where you did take the mattress off to do part of the rubbing, it never went to the studio, or it was always done under the bed?
It was always done under the bed. So my house was
Full of graphite.
yes, covered in plastic, basically. Yeah.
And this might not have, I mean, I don't know, might only be of interest to me in some ways, but do you feel like if you had brought your mattress into the studio and did the rubbings there, that would somehow be incommensurate with the process, or with like a sincerity of that act?
Well, I think the way the rubbing started was a way to get outside the studio. Not this one, just generally. It was a way to be in this is the first time I did a rubbing the second time I did a rubbing in an interior space. They started as spaces outside on the sidewalk, or, you know, in the open for me. I wouldn't do it in the studio. It would have to be where it was situated or located.
In that sense, it's like a photograph. You have to be in the space, in that space, taking that object, or like grasping that moment to bring that, you know, that weight or that sense, that feeling into the work. It can't be fake, because you will feel it.
Yeah.
Well, also this idea of fake, you know, like the studio as it's not a fake space, but it's a separate space. Like, I've always thought of it as a separate space for my life space. But how do the two things where do they meet? Where do they come together? What are the decisions that I'm making outside that influence that space? You know, it's always kind of how are they colliding or not colliding.
And it kind of, or maybe I'm just going to project for a moment or make something up, and you can say I'm wrong, but we were just talking about, you had graduate school and then you were in the core program, and you're very excited to be away from institutions. And the way that the studio for you has been, for 4 years now, an institutional space. To me seems really significant. So it's fake in that way, or something. So like really searching for a real, what is my life, right? Like what?
Where is it?
Where is my life?
Yeah, because we don't have a life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I know. Don't get you started on it.
We don't have a life. It's just from our apartment. We wake up, we go to our studios like every day.
But I think that's also an excuse. You know, it's like it's not just an institution. Like that question is there wherever. You know, if you're going to have a studio space or a studio practice, where, like I keep saying, where do the two collide? Or just even having the space at home where when I was doing the rubbing, you know, does that become the studio space then? And I couldn't cook at home for the time that I was doing the rubbing because it was graphite.
But it's back to that issue of grasping the real. That
Yes.
like, it's like, what do we mean when we say the real? It's like I start thinking like, maybe by the real you mean limits, or something that you bump into that hurts, or something that feels like it has a real impact.
You know, those energies that we are dealing with all the time in reality, or like that mean institutions, that mean power structures that we are in, and how our bodies and our characters come together, and like where's the struggle, you know, those forces always playing there. That's the real for me.
What I also really find interesting, what I really like about this work is that it works as a metaphor. It's not simply functioning as a kind of symbol of your thinking. Getting into semiotics, you know, it's not something like a sign, but it basically sits there and it is that. So when you talked about it, you start to talk about real or true, and you talk about how she has to go into bed to do it, otherwise it's not true. I don't know if I use the word true, but I think you meant that, and that you can feel it. And I think, well, exactly, you know, because it's meant to be a metaphor, which is to me very resonant. It's meaningful, I like that.
I don't know. It's just that when I'm in front of a work, it's not only about, and I deal with that a lot in my work. I bring signs into my studio, and when I take photographs, I think about what those signs mean in terms of content, but also the feeling of it. When you're in front of a work, there's a feeling of it that is there. It's the intellectual, but it's the sensual, it's the senses working too. I think both, they need to meet to be a good work. For me, it's my personal, you know. They both need to be there to make it very strong. But you feel the weight of it. So, yeah, I think it's very important. And also, I was thinking about the context in terms of your work, but also I was thinking about the context in terms of the windows. Because this work that I brought here, I made half of it in here. So the work I have, this work that I have here is an installation that I have in my studio. There are 15 pieces. It's a work that is practically in a space that is 15 feet by 30 feet. But I have to remake it in here. It changed the work. It changed. It's very different from the pieces that I have in my studio. They're Chicago windows, but they also, what's interesting for me is like they meet what Fatima has in her work about Chicago. You know, I let my work breathe in here and grasp that to bring it in the gallery. It's not me putting something from Houston. So I remade it for here, but it came out being very different, even though that I use similar materials. But it transformed it. But I let it breathe because the context was different. So that was important too, in terms of the context of the work.
What's part of what, I mean, this is the most obvious thing I could say, but just when you first hung this photo up, I was just like, that looks just like a Chicago window. And you said you photographed it in Houston. It's so, like that just, it just freaks me out, that photo. You know, thinking about, yeah.
Well, what happened is like I told.
Feels like I'm in Chicago when I'm looking at it, but I have to keep thinking about Houston. But.
But the thing that what happens, we came to visit the space, and I saw the windows outside this area, and I was okay. That's something that I'm dealing with, that I wanted to be in Houston, but also it applies to Chicago, it applies to United States today in general. But then when I asked Sean for windows, I gave him specific descriptions of the windows, and he sent me a photo. I was like, oh, this is perfect, because I thought they were identical to the ones that I in my studio. When he put them up and he sent me a photo, I was like, oh, this is different. But then I have 5 prints in my studio, and then with the form of the windows, I decided, okay, this is the print that has to go to Chicago with those windows. So I thought about the relationship of these windows and the print. They have to be in conversation. So I immediately thought about this one. I'm thinking also about the outside of this building. So all these things I take in consideration when I put the work. For me, they were very important. Even the materials are similar to the one that I have in my studio, but they're different. They came up being different. I was like yesterday, oh, maybe I should take these windows to Houston. I like them, you know.
With the bricks.
Everything, yeah, like this, up there. Yeah. And I like, oh, sorry. No, sorry.
There's one thing that Molly mentioned earlier about sort of the influence of the institution.
Mm-hmm.
If both of you could sort of, because I sort of see it in everything, almost, at least in my head. But there's a relationship between two things. That the institution, your relationship to the institution, where you come from, as it relates to some sort of like self-imposed institution, or sort of like the institution of your own mind, sort of like that sort of structure.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you guys can talk about that as it relates to what you were talking about earlier, about fake, about sort of what is fake and how it's, what is real in terms of like your studio space and your home space. Is that making sense? You see what I'm saying? This weird sort of like triangle between the three things that I want you guys to sort of talk about.
Would you say that once again?
Yeah, you're tired.
I'm thinking about 3 different things, and it's what's something you mentioned about the relationship between what is fake and what is real in terms of the way that I was understanding it. There's a difference between studio and home, and I'm like, how you sort of like work that through. When you have this sort of, if there is, I think there is, when you have this sort of self-imposed instruction or institution in your own head. I guess focus on that, forget about the institution, but that relationship I'm curious about.
I think we all do, because we have a routine. You know, there's a routine. Whether it's a lack of routine, we get up, we sleep. There's a system to things. You know, there's a night, there's a day, there's a morning, there's a kind of.
And we all have to work to survive.
Yeah.
You know, that's a structure.
There is a system, a structure. You know, the 2 words also have a different sense of time to them. You think of system, you think of structure. Structure I think of more as like a daily routine kind of time in terms of measurable time. System I don't think of as measurable time somehow. And I'm going off in a tangent now.
It's okay, I did too.
Yeah. No, say those words again. Institution.
The real,
yeah. Fake, and
I guess I was just
and the work, and the work being so formal is formal, because you know that when you were saying that, I thought about the work being like, because people think about that the work is formal, it comes out of an institution like of the academia, But then also I feel that my studio for me is my life, and it's as real as my life. That I decided to be like that. This is my reality. My work is my reality. What I do every day in my studio, that's what I decided to do as an artist. And I have to just embrace it. So I don't feel in a way it's not fake for me. It's real. It's my lab. It's what I think. It's what I struggle. It's what I do all these things. I react to the world. Institutions also, there's a struggle there, like the academia or this like type of programs that they have their politics, and we have to deal with all those politics, and we struggle through that, and we react to them in the work too. And that's part of being real too. That's part of it, or that's part of our decision. So I think that in my work, that struggle with institutions, it's important in my work, because I react in the installation space. I react not in here because this is like a gallery. This is different, but in institutions, when I install, I address the institutional space as something that I have to react to. So for me, it's just another structure that I use, but I struggle through it, and I react to.
I think a word that you used was limitations, right? Did you say limitations?
That's another word.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's an interesting word because Lourdes is talking about institutions and having this political kind of undertone. But we also have that, and you said that about personal space, right? You have that in your personal space too, like still rubbing under a full-size bed, for instance. And that's a that's a specific limitation versus a twin-size bed or a queen-size. You're always kind of constructing these limitations within your life, whether you kind of acknowledge them or are conscious of them or not. And I think maybe that's another way of thinking about it, whether it's thinking about the academic institution or thinking about it in terms of the private kind of domestic, or not even domestic, but just a private space.
Just to pick up on that thought, so it seems like the way the show's arranged, you suggested this is a kind of private sphere, this is a public sphere, and then you have the windows that, in theory, would act as a threshold that you would pass between the private and public sphere. And so, and we've talked a little bit about place in, Chicago, Houston. But I guess I'm curious about the space that's actually in the work, that all of it seems really, it's fully frontal and very surface. And even the thresholds, the things that we would pass through to get between a public and a private sphere are they're blocked, right? So can you talk about why is this like a conscious decision to make any passage between a private and public sphere, or something like that?
I think it came together naturally.
I don't think they're different. Like, I think there is a negation of making them different in the work. Whether it's in relation to my work with Lourdes' work or in relation to our work in itself, there is a kind of collapsing of the two. Like I said, even a window space, for instance, it's a space that's inside and outside, or it's the pillow space versus the space under the bed. It's they're two very, very different spaces. The space under the bed kind of remains there. When you move from a building or a flat or a whatever apartment, that space remains there, but the pillow space doesn't, right? The pillow kind of gets packed up and shipped away or whatever, you take it with you. So for me, there is a kind of collapsing that public, private, where does one end and where does the other begin? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I see that in your work with coming from a mental space to a physical space versus a Lourdes that's a physicality that moves forward, a mentality kind of. That shift is very interesting and makes sense to what you're talking about.
I kind of see like head versus gut. I mean, this one gets my gut because I want a window that I can see through, damn it. You got bricks there, you know. So I have this real anger about our country and the way things are collapsing around us, that you can't even keep a window useful, you know. It has to have an immediate ending. In fact, that's what perhaps our society is asking of us. Give us only this much, you know. Imagine that screen is the world. There's nothing behind it. I'm sorry. And then here is the real mind blower, because for me that's black hole, nighttime, entering, get sucked in, entering, don't know where you're going, moment of collapse, it's over, sorry, time stopped, zap. I don't know. You guys are all able, because you're artists, to talk about it in these ephemeral ways. But for me, it hits my gut. I'm sorry.
No.
No, that's good. But,
Yeah.
I mean, but what about this stuff in relation to the building next door, where all the windows are blown out and abandoned, and there's this purple coat that's been flopped over the window frame for months now? And I feel like what they're both sort of indicating.
I saw it, yes.
It's super intense. I think that what the bricks are doing is like they're articulating a limit, right? They're pointing to this end, but with attention and with investment in articulating the limit. I feel like that's the thing. There's something like, for me, I guess, on the gut level, quite a bit more harrowing with the empty windows next door. That should be an emancipatory gesture. It should be like, oh, anything is possible. The windows are blown out, but like utterly abandoned, like no attention, no investment there. I feel like that's the split for me, as ephemeral as that might sound. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah. Sorry, I figured you saw that when you were outside.
No, and also I was thinking like with the windows, like what does it mean to be closed off as a human being or as a society? Why do we close off each other? We're not always guarding each other, you know, pushing out. So like protecting each other. That's like guarding, you know. Also, it have these double connotations.
We talked a number of times about eyes, right?
The windows of the soul.
The eyes being the windows to the soul is this sort of cliche or something, but that the extent of the trauma that it seems that so many people are existing in these days means that we're always looking for sort of new techniques for reading other people, and going back to old techniques, like you can just see it in their eyes or something. But this
No meaning.
Right. Where is the meaning? Where's the pushback? I mean, that we started this conversation talking about, that you guys started talking about why you work together, right? That it's like you want connection from somebody, or you want pushback from somebody. It's just like, give me something. Tell me to fuck off. Do anything. Just do something at me. Yeah.
That in that sense comes back to Michelle's writing, you know, the ontological, yeah. Those two really, like the psychological, the epistemological, and the ontological, both back and forth. What is mean? Where does the meaning lies? Where is it in terms of, you know, in the psychological, in the physical, in both? The relationship between the physical and the psychological in space.
I keep thinking about these, and maybe somebody else can help, because it's not a fully formed thought, but the peripheral experience, like when I'm looking at this one and getting this one, my peripheral vision, the experience of softness and roundedness, and then when I'm looking at this one, the kind of hard, cold, metallic experience of this one in my peripheral vision. However, when I look at this one directly, I feel the coldness of photography. When I look at this one directly, I feel velvet.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and so it's interesting the way that they're operating in that.
The push and pull.
Yeah. And in terms of photographic space versus real.
But they're both photographic space. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna mention that when you talk about power structures and looking at your work, I just think it's really interesting how, I mean, I question who has the power, or what structure are we looking at? Are we looking at, like in your work, external powers, these power structures from outside that you are giving us an image, or like you have the power, like you're presenting an image of your power structure and the way that you communicate that in a very like clear way in terms of the
Direct.
words and the obscuring, like covering everything. And then for your work, I'm really interested now that I hear you talk about it, because I read and I was curious about the way that you would convey that. I mean, if there was any relation at all with the power structure, how you relate to that, or do you feel that in any way when you're communicating with your work, when you're doing your pieces? Do you feel, I don't know, I mean, this might sound silly, but do you feel like in some way there's this, you are, like, not that you have the power, but like you're wanting to have this, you know, force, like this force transmitted from the space that you live in?
What do you mean by power structure in this specific context?
Well, that's what I'm curious. I mean, power structure, in terms of Lourdes' work, it's more clear to me in terms of what we see, what is obstructed, also location. Like, this is a window from maybe this area, but it would be a very different image if we went to another place in Chicago. But then, I mean, it's deep in several levels. But then in your work, I feel now like that denseness from like in that piece. And I wonder if there was any relation at all with power structures within your work, or if it's something that's not really there.
Well, I think it's more to do with how we think we know something, right? Like the knowledge of something, the naming of something, the fact that it's space under the bed versus having it untitled, for instance, or not disclosing what it is. I think it's more about that kind of power structure. Well, I don't know if power structure is the right word for that in this given, in the work, but I keep going back to the thing of knowing something. Like, how do we know something? If we start questioning that, then we kind of do break that power structure, right? We break something being familiar or known or named in that as well. Like the space under the bed, again, it's the bed, you know, it's something that we kind of know as soon as we name it.
I think that's happening here, a shift from, I guess, a shift of power towards the unintelligibility of things, of these spaces, of these like material. A shift of power away, if we're going to speak in those terms, away from sort of the reassuring institution that we live in. Normally, we take our stability from this sort of brutal fact of brick buildings around us. You know, that's how we situate ourselves in reality. And you sort of, through abstraction, by abstracting these things and bring them to this sort of artificial space, reasserting their unintelligibility.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I have a question. In making this piece, were you lying on the paper?
Yes.
Because for me, I think weight comes across in the show very strongly. I love, from where I'm looking at this, I feel like the body was there. And when Molly said velvet, I was thinking body or the undulation, so I could almost feel your presence there without you being there. And then looking around the room, I feel like the recycling or reuse of things. The material they feel like they all had a life before they got here, which interests me as well. So there's sort of a humanness in the materiality of things, even though they seem very formal and kind of. I mean, I think that's what I'm caught by, and especially this, confronting it from here, really gives it another kind of meaning. Because if you made it, I mean, how did you approach? Can you say a little bit how you started this project, this piece?
Well, they're pretty straightforward.
So it's just a piece of paper under the bed.
Yes, I laid it down and then I put the bed back where it was, so it was kind of held with the bed. And the tape was the part that held the edge, and then just rubbing it from one end to the other.
I have a question about the performative aspect of that, but before that, I agree with you in terms of, I feel like there's a way that you guys are using detachment of sort of cold quality or formal aspects of this stuff. You're using it in a way that's like a really thin veil over what you're saying. Like it is really.
I call it rigor.
Shazam!
I call it that formal. I call it rigor.
Yeah, I think it's as much as it is rigor, I still feel I can't think of any other way to say it than it feels like a really thin veil or something that's very private and very.
I mean,
human or something like that.
At first you're confronted and feel, oh, like this, and the more you look, it's more like the stuff is taking you in because of maybe it's life before it got here. Whether it's not fresh and new. It's sort of scuffy and recycled, and the cuts aren't perfect. There's an imperfection in the formalness, which I really like what's happening there. It's kind of a contradiction. This one I can't see so well, but I love seeing the back of it. And but I see your rigor like laying bricks. The pieces in between, the putty in between the pieces, and all that. But there is a kind of rough beauty about it, kind of a tough and
let things
imperfect.
be. Yeah.
Imperfect.
Yeah, it's like I was thinking about it yesterday because I saw these windows here and I was like, oh, this is not working. On Friday I was like, oh my god, this is not working. But I was like, okay, I'm gonna make it work. And it's just bringing the materials and like forcing them enough just to let them be what they are and take their own form. It's more, when I think about that, I think about energy of the material, like the energy of the work. There's something that I had to put together, and I have to put like my physical strength there, but just enough to make it be, to let it be the way it is, or take its own form.
Did you bring some of this from Houston, or is this all Chicago material?
All Chicago materials, except the print.
Yeah, but I agree kind of with Julius. When you come in first, it looks like very, rigorous, very uptight, very cold, but once you start noticing the weight of the work, I was thinking of billboards and putting advertisements. So I thought this becomes a very personal piece, and mostly because of the bed, right? Because when you look at it, maybe it's just like the scale of the room. I don't know. It doesn't look like a queen size, or it looks like a tiny bed. So two people don't really fit in there. From this perspective, I could be wrong. And when you look at these windows, they don't look like windows from a home. They look like windows from a supermarket that's been emptied out. So it's kind of like they're trying to say something about their personal lives. And there's this wall or this thing that doesn't make it probably as sentimental as maybe it should be. That's not what you're trying to achieve anyway. And the reasons I got all these stuff in my head is because I was reading Michelle's essay, and it's like an essay about philosophy. And so, I don't know, this didn't make any sense with what I was looking at,
But for me it makes sense because I think about philosophy a lot. when I do the work.
I think there's a matter of factness about the work. Maybe that's why, you know, they're used things, but they're not aesthetic. There's nothing, at least that's how I see it. They're not aesthetic decisions. They're kind of, okay, this needs to be this size because this is the size under the bed. This needs to be this width because the thickness of the brick has to be held within the window, you know. So it's very kind of decisions based on the thing that you're starting off of. As well, and maybe that's why the sentimental or the subjectivity. You know, you're always making subjective decisions, right? But how do you kind of try and eliminate those for yourselves? You know, what are the limitations? I guess again, given to you within the thing that you've set out to work with.
Yeah, I think there's a relationship between what you said earlier about sort of like the ability to know what things called, or like to know how to name something, and the sort of procedural aspect of what you're talking about, like the matter of factness. I feel like those are pretty related, pretty strong. And I think that's, for me, I guess that's what, again, with the rigor, all the same thing. It's like we really sort of like do this. That's what I guess that's one of the reasons why I was asking about the whole self-imposed rule thing. Because it's like, as rigorous as this is, it's still.
We're not also over aestheticizing. Like I put those bricks there. I didn't look at them while I was putting them. I just put them there, and when they were done, they were done. I look at them. I was like, they look good. You know, it's the way it is. And also, when people put those things outside, they look the way they look. They just board it up. They don't think about aesthetic decisions. It's just a function. It's fun. For me, functions. It's just of language. It's not about aestheticizing it. And I don't want to make them pretty objects. It's not about that. It's about like conversation, language, knowledge, or like interpretation of the word. It interests me.
Well, that's the thing, you know, form. We think of form and content as different, but or we can think of form and content as different, but they're not. If something's boarded up and it looks like that, there's a specific context to it because it looks like that. Yeah.
Right, and I feel like Tony's question and your question too initially were about how do you assert presence, like the presence of the individual or the human within such a constraint-based system. Whether the constraints come from a larger institutional apparatus like a school or a culture or a language system, or if it comes from this like elective position of taking those things on, internalizing them, or sort of like acknowledging the internalization of larger superstructures, right? Just like we have to speak in code because that's how we communicate. And I feel like that's part of what you're asking, like, to what extent is this elective, to what extent is it a trap? Right, and like how do you know, the assertion of presence in all of these is touch, do this right, just like the laying of the brick, the tracing of the floor, and like it is a tricky epistemological situation, I think, which is what shows, right?
I also get, I don't know how many of you guys agree with me, but like if I didn't know about about the show, I just came into it. It looks like a one-person show. And I've been wondering about, the whole time I was looking at it, was like wondering about, the relationship between you both and how it came to be, and, what got you together besides from just working at the, being in the same institution. What is it about you both that you can kind of relate to each other in such a way that it just looks like a one-person show?
Well,
if you know them, I feel like it really looks like a two-person show. I mean, for me, I'm like, oh my god, Fatima versus Lourdes, really? Like, who's winning? Like, I mean, there's this. I'm feeling the tension between them, so it's interesting to hear that it might not look that.
I think that when I saw Fatima's work the first time in Houston, and I told her the other day, I was like, I recognized something about her work that I had in my work. I don't know what it is yet, and we know that we have something in common, but I can't verbalize it. There's something there that we know that is very similar, and things that are very different, but we have also this formal vocabulary that it has its tangents. But I remember before coming in here, we pre-installed in my studio more or less similar, the show. We knew how we were going to place the work, and the director of the program came to give us advice, and he looked at the work and he said, well, this is the closest that you can get, both of you, with your work. Which means that we are being affecting each other, or how is it called that, like influencing each other in the conversation. And the work got very, very close. And he said, like, okay, this is the closest. Now it's like, of course, we have to just finish the program and do other things that informs our work, and maybe it will get, like, that gap, it will be broader again. But I think that's a decision that we made in the program to grow, because we've seen other people in there that they don't have a conversation and their work hasn't grown. So for us, it was very important that we had to take advantage of the time and space that we had, and like, okay, we're here, we have to make it, we have to work it, or we have to make it work. So if there's no conversation for us in here, and we acknowledge that there's a conversation between us, let's take advantage of that, or let's grow with that. So I think that, yeah, there's a lot of similarities right now. We're very close at this point, and I think that's important that we put this show together to see that and talk about it, and what's their differences here, even though that is very, very close.
I think our starting points are very different, though. We may come to the same place, but our starting points are very different with the work. That I still feel.
Well, you. Oh, go ahead.
Maybe you can even help me, Molly, because I still can't articulate it, but there's, when I think about it, this sort of like sliding scale of public versus private, or even through windows being kind of the like what I think about metaphorically with windows, versus even kind of how you kind of deal with the well, in this show with the studio versus home thing. There's like a sliding scale there too, and I think both of you, in a way, maybe this isn't quite how I'm going to say it, but there is a sort of like generosity or something in terms of maybe that is something that both of you are kind of doing in a similar way, but or exposing perhaps in a similar way, but dealing with them differently. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but I've been thinking about that for 5 minutes.
About being generous?
Well, generous might be the wrong word, but perhaps that you guys are sort of giving up something in your own practice, and thinking about these issues of public versus private, or like being an artist, or not even that broad. It's more narrow. I just can't articulate it.
Can I babble for a second? Just because so I've been thinking about paranoia, and I've been thinking about
or experiencing it.
I'm experiencing and thinking about the public versus the private in relation to that, and then thinking about that in relation to an institutional critique. And then I have this Walter Ben Michaels quote in my head, which I can't quote, but so this idea basically that as a worker, one gives up 8 hours of one's day, every day, to work in order to keep the other 16 or whatever, I'm gonna do bad math, the other rest of the day to oneself. And in so doing, one asserts that part of one's time belongs to oneself. But if one gives one's entire self, i.e. in institutional critique work, or as a slave, or in any other fashion, when one's entire self is given, one is actually as a submissive. He's actually talking about it in terms of masochism. If one gives one's entire self over to something, then that is asserting that one's entire self belongs to someone, to you, and that's how you can give it over, or something. And then I think once doing that, then I have this bell hooks quote that I've been carrying around for my whole life, which is that if one lives one's life in such a way that blank, you don't have to worry about what your neighbors think about what you do. So I had it like, I wrote it around the top of my apartment when I was 20 years old or whatever, and didn't have any curtains. And that sort of like, in terms of institution or having the institution inside oneself, if you give up any right to any kind of privacy, then you have this sort of other kind of freedom, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Is this making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Is this related?
Well, we bought time, you know, in the institution. We have the freedom to do the work all the time, to make the work like...
To make the thing the same, right? To make the privacy the same as the public, to make the work everything. Will you choose to keep doing that when you go your separate ways?
I'm still trying. I personally get tired of it because it's... One thing is like, oh, I'm going to the institution, I think it's going to be like this. It's never the way you think it's going to be. And of course I want my privacy, I want to have a life, and I don't want to give up everything, but at the same time, I'm very lucky that I can go every day to my studio and spend there 12 hours if I want. And I get paid for that. And I think that's giving up is like a give and take. I have more time than a lot of people that have, because I can be in the studio all the time for a year and a half or 2 years, no interruptions, just making work and work and work. But in that sense, I'm giving something. I'm giving my privacy, but I'm receiving something that for me means a lot.
And I think that relationship is always there, right? Even if you're not in an academic institution, you do have, like you said in the beginning, you do have to survive, right? You are working for something, whether that's work selling something, whether that's work in the studio, whether that's work that's laborious. There is that always present. So I think the context can change, but I don't think that really changes. You're always bound to it.
It's negotiating, you know. You're negotiating all the time, that time, that 24 hours a day.
I mean, it's something I think about all the time, like, do artists take vacations, you know? What do you do with your free time? What kind of hobbies do you have? You know,
I don't have any.
Right, I have no hobbies, I have no free time, I don't take vacations.
I haven't taken vacations since 2008, and it's 2012.
But it's also a luxury to be, you know,
of course.
That's also a vacation in some ways, all the time.
Yeah. Of course, and then so it's a different kind of. To me, that's how I sort of think about it.
Like when do you think about it as work? When do you think about it as not work? Either. I think Tony was saying that as well. You know, internalized institutions, maybe. Right. Yeah. For me, the term public-private, it's just fascinating that we still think about them as separate. Or it's so convenient to think about them as separate.
Well, I'm thinking about this in terms of going back to the thing about the real, and the idea of the real actually in that sense of it being the thing that cannot be contained in language, and it's the thing that actually undoes you. It's the thing that you can't, you're negotiating its forcefulness or its overwhelmingness. And so I'm just thinking about this in terms of practice, the idea of practice or discipline or work as the thing that tames or makes sense of the force, the big force, this thing, the real. And whether or not, like there's this interesting thing about you're saying public-private, but is the studio the place that is actually controlled and contained and not real, or is the studio actually the place that is the upheaval, the undoing, where the the valve is let open and actually everything falls apart? And so that question, and then how do you then figure out what work's relationship is to that? Is work the thing that dams it up, that helps it make sense? Is work the thing that calms you down? I mean, just thinking about those questions kind of off the same point. But this idea of kind of, and I don't know if you have anything to say about that, just kind of in terms of what your practice feels like for you in your life, like what it is for you, what it does for you. But I think the thing about that, negotiating the idea of kind of work, either work play, work pleasure, work in a real, those things are coming together for me.
I don't know if I have anything to say, but that's a really interesting, that's a really good it's just, it rings true when you say that. Like when you were saying that, I was thinking about being in the studio and having a day where I do nothing. I sit there, it's like, that's work, but where's the work? Where's the link, Like, yeah, and then there's a time when I'm not in the studio, but I'm doing a rubbing out on the, it's like, and that's work or labor or
reading
or even if you take a photo, if you take a camera and walk around and you're taking photographs, but where, so it is this idea of also questioning where is the work?
Where's the boundary?
Yeah.
So, I mean, in terms of that, I mean, when I came up to this piece, the first thing I thought about was the time. The time it took to make this. And I envisioned, you, the maker, doing that in real time. How long did this piece take?
In hours or days?
However you want to describe it.
Well, it was maybe about 30 days, but not constantly.
Sure.
Maybe like
but you
2
did
hours.
Over a 30-day period.
Yeah, 2 hours a day. 2.5 hours a day of working and then cleaning. Yeah. The cleaning is more. It's exactly where does the work again? Like is the cleaning the work or is that do I count that as time that's part of the work? Because that's life as it's also
Also figuring out the work is work. Figuring out the work is work. Thinking about the work is work. You're working all the time, I bet, We're all thinking about art.
But sometimes you're very unconscious. I mean, you could be doing the laundry and looking at the bubbles in the washing machine and think, oh my God. You're excited about, it could be very indirect. It's sort of like the flow of life. Is there are no boundaries, especially now you see everything is so fluid between one discipline and another and one act and another. And it seems like it's just one big thing. I don't know how important it is to have to departmentalize it. This is my studio life, this is my work life. When all of them sort of have it, for me, I can think of them interplaying with one another. So it's just this big soup of stuff, life, that, I don't know how, if that, it seemed like is it important that you distinguish these boundaries, or are you complexed about it, or, it seems like what is the issue about it that's kind of exciting for you?
I think when there are no boundaries, that's when it becomes more complicated. That's when it does become, that's when you question it. I think if there were clear boundaries where you could stop and start, or where you could define it, then there wouldn't be a kind of questioning of it. So I don't think it's, I just feel that's the space for questioning it, or that creates a space for questioning it, whether you want it or not, whether you want to be questioning it or not.
Again, I think that as with the introduction of the human, I think Judith brings up a really, really important point about ontology, or about being, or about the sort of potential flux of things, and the lack of maybe rigor in delimiting those things. I think that, the previous sort of segment of the conversation is completely fascinating, just like practice, discipline, work, rigor, and like then the real being the opposite, the undoing, the valve sort of blowing out all potential order in that. But like, so we're determining that like, yes, these are good soldierly practices, and like the work stuff, like I think we feel that we recognize it emphatically. But like, where's the, like, is there play, I guess, is what I want to know. If part of the potentially emancipatory gift of being an artist is the potential to have things erupt or become disordered enough to be able to play. That's, I think, part of Tori's question too. It's just like, we do carry our institutions inside of us, of course we do, like, but can it erupt into something else? Do you feel in service to the set of power structures, ideas, and your own sort of individual resistance against those things, or can it become something else? Do you feel like you're able to play ever, like within the sort of constraints that you've elected to set up for yourselves?
Of course.
You do? Good. Good. I mean, that's what I
in my
want that,
studio,
you know? Like,
for me, it's like my life goes around my studio. It's like that's where I'm happy. When I'm in my studio figuring out things and things come together, that's where I'm more the happiest person in the world. That's what I live for. And at this moment, maybe, you never know. But that's the decision that I made. I want to live around that because that's where I feel complete when I'm like doing this thing that it comes out of nothing. When it takes form or it takes physicality. And I don't know, and I was telling the other day, Fatima, I figured out this piece in 1 year. It took me 1.5 years. And I don't know how it came together. I can't say it anymore. Because it became so, it's like magic. You put it together, it's just a lot of intuition there. You know what it means. You need a lot of time to like think about it, what these things mean in terms of interpretation. What are they conveying? And for me, that's the moment that I'm like always look for when I'm working, and when I get that moment that is like magic, it's just like that's what I live for,
No, that's super awesome to hear. Just like I wanted somehow the word work and the word joy to like get together, because otherwise it seems so service oriented. And like I appreciate it deeply.
But
like,
that's
I think it's curiosity though.
Masochism by giving your entire self over.
Yeah, but that's the sacrifice of it.
The sacrifice of it and the joy of that sacrifice, right? Because then all of your time belongs to you, and you're a slave.
It is like
and it's wonderful to yourself.
It is like vacation constantly as well. I mean, it's work and a vacation, both at the same time. It's curiosity. I mean, the space under my bed or my pillow. It's like it's curiosity.
Just
your curiosity.
Can you invest everything with this kind of attention or this kind of potential for curiosity?
I don't know how long. I mean, maybe it ends tomorrow. That's it. Over.
No more choice.
Then we have to go to the real world and work and then struggle like a lot of people do. But now we bought this time, just like we compromise this time.
Like, but this is okay. So the real world and have to work. So now we're back to the issue of the real.
I don't think like that though.
Okay, good. Because I don't think
this
it's possible, and then it has to do with Judith's question about why would you want the boundaries.
I don't think of those, but that's what I was trying to say. For me, it's like when you said that what happens when you guys go your own, and I was saying we're always part of that institution, right? Whether it's the academic institution or working for a job, as a I don't know.
But the functions or that the time shift. Yeah. I understand that the time shift and the way we deal with time is different depending on what type of institution we are or what type of job we have. Do we have time shift because everything is structured in time.
Can you describe how is it working in that part of Texas, or what's your because it's not you're not in one of the coasts. You're pretty much in one specific area in which you don't. I'm guessing you don't have too much to do during.
But we decided also. It's a decision that we made not to do much and just be in our studio because other people have life.
It's not like you're going every Friday to 100 shows. Like you have to work.
No, we don't go to shows. Period. Forget about shows. Of course, there's things that we have to deal with, but it's more about. At least we both decided to do that in terms of for the work, to make it grow and then come back. I want to go to the East Coast after the core program, but I needed to get the work in a.
What I'm trying to figure out is the environment. I mean, you're working in an institution, but it's set up in this particular place where, right, it pretty much makes you want to have to stay in your studio, right? Because that's what I've heard from other people.
No, I think that would be true anywhere as well. I think it's like staring at the pillow for me is also work. You know, and that could happen in Houston, that could happen, you know, in Chicago, Lahore, whatever. It could happen anywhere. And I think Houston does give you that kind of space and time as a city. It's an easier city, it's a cheaper city, but I think it could happen anywhere. I think it's a decision that you, again, to your question of time, you know, it's like,
it's a decision.
It's a decision that you kind of choose where
how I invest
24 hours in a day, basically.
How I invest my time, or in what things I invest my time, and it's a decision that you do. Maybe.
Also, in terms of what you were talking about, what you were saying about separating like the real world and then going to the studio and working, and how like you were talking about it's like a fluid thing, that I think that's totally fine. Like everyone has their own perception of like separating, you know, life in different ways, like different compartments, and feel comfortable with it. Like I don't think there's anything like it has to be this certain way in order for me to make work or like think about that type of thing. That's sort of my.
We should end
Okay.
guys,
It's totally fun. It's totally